In this video, we're going to discuss topicality. Most debate resolutions are broad statements proposing changes in government policy. For example, in this video series, our resolution is resolved. The United States federal government should substantially restrict private sector emissions of greenhouse gases in the United States. The role of the affirmative team is to prove that the judge should endorse the resolution. Affirmative teams do this by proposing a plan that is an example of a policy change that both fits within the resolution and is a better policy than either the status quo or a competing policy option. The role of the negative is to either prove that the affirmative plan is worse than the status quo or a competing option, or that the plan is not an example of a policy change permitted by the resolution. Topicality is thus an off-case argument advanced by the negative, claiming that the affirmative's plan does not fit under the resolution and is thus not topical. Many teams affirmed the greenhouse gas emissions resolution by arguing that the United States federal government should implement a carbon tax. Negative teams often claimed that this plan was not topical because a carbon tax was not a restriction. Most topicality arguments are based on the idea that limiting affirmative plans to those allowed by the resolution makes for fairer and more educational debates. There are two basic ways to structure a topicality argument. Both models make the same argument but are organized a bit differently. You should use the structure recommended by your coach. The first is the traditional model, which has 4 parts. Subpoint A, interpretation. Subpoint B, violation. Subpoint C, standards. Subpoint D, voters. The reasons to prefer model has 3 parts. A, interpretation. B, violation. C, reasons to prefer. Here's an example of how the 1 and C would present a topicality argument using the reasons to prefer method. Now let's go into more detail about each of these argument parts. An interpretation is an argument that the debate community should assign a particular meaning to a word or phrase in the resolution. Interpretations thus tell us which types of plan actions are available for the affirmative to include in their plan, and which types of actions are not. Although an interpretation is an argument made by the debaters, they are almost always supported by definitions. Definitions are pieces of evidence that outline the meaning of a word or phrase in the resolution. Definitions come from a number of sources, including general-purpose dictionaries, such as Merriam-Webster's, specialized dictionaries, such as Black's Law Dictionary, legislation, which often defines key terms contained in laws, and expert opinion, especially from researchers trying to define important terms in their field of study. The violation explains why the affirmative team's plan falls outside of the negative interpretation. One important thing to remember is that only the affirmative plan needs to be topical. The advantages that an affirmative team claims are irrelevant to topicality. Standards are a reason why we should prefer one definition of a word or phrase over other competing definitions. Standards need to match up closely with definitions. Some common topicality standards include Brightline, which claims we should prefer definitions that are easy to apply to an affirmative's plan. Expertise, which claims that we should prefer definitions that come from experts in the topic area. Common use, which claims we should prefer definitions that reflect the way most people use a word or phrase. Limits, which claims we should prefer definitions that permit a smaller number of affirmative plans, enabling in-depth research, preparation, and topic education. And ground, which claims we should prefer definitions that fairly divide topic arguments between the affirmative and negative. This is just a small sample of potential standards. You'll encounter many more as you debate different topicality arguments. Next is voters. These are reasons why the affirmative team should lose the debate on topicality even if they win that their plan is a good idea. Although there are many ways to describe topicality voters, almost all of those voters boil down to 2 main reasons, namely fairness. Restricting plans to the resolution ensures that both the affirmative and negative have a roughly equal chance to win any given debate. And second is education. Restricting plans to the resolution ensures that we focus our research on the important issues outlined by the resolution. As explained earlier, both the traditional and reasons to prefer model include both an interpretation and a violation. The main difference between the models is that the reasons to prefer approach combines the standards and voters pieces of the traditional model into discrete arguments about why the negative's interpretation should be preferred or judged as best for the debate community. When an affirmative team finds the topicality of their plan contested by their opponents, There are three types of arguments that they should include into their 2AC to respond. First, the affirmative should challenge the violation by arguing how their plan meets the negative's interpretation. Second, the affirmative should provide a counter-interpretation of the topic that they claim is better than the interpretation offered by the negative team. A counter-interpretation includes two parts. Initially, a counter-interpretation should be based on a strong definition. It's also very important that the affirmative team's plan meets their own counter-interpretation. Additionally, the affirmative should provide one or more reasons why their counter-interpretation is better than the negative's interpretation. Ideally, these reasons should make comparisons between the affirmative and negative arguments and account for the justifications that the negative included in their 1NC topicality argument. Third, the affirmative should contest the claimed importance of rejecting their plan as untopical. For example, the affirmative could argue that the judge should accept any reasonable interpretation of the resolution, or that limits imposed by the resolution's research base means we should not be worried about broad interpretations of the resolution. That's all we have for Topicality for now. Tune in next time as we discuss critiques.